Hello and welcome to Up and Running with Mental Ray in Maya. My name is Brian Bradley and I'm really looking forward to helping you become familiar with what for many has become the default production renderer of choice in the Maya application. In Chapter 1 of the course we will cover some of the basic aspects of Mental Ray workflow in Maya, including a look at options such as progressive IPR and colour management. In Chapter 2 we will start to dig into Mental Ray in earnest by taking a look at some of its well-established and key lighting tools such as the physical sun and sky and exposure or tone mapping controls, along with a consideration of lighting options that have recently become much more accessible, such as Mental Ray's native IBL rendering mode. From here we can pick up the pace, as it were, and look in successive chapters at Mental Ray's primary global illumination tools, its extensive material options, which will include using both the Mia Material X and the newer Mila material to recreate some basic surface types, as well as taking a very close look at the Mia car paint phenomenon. Chapter 5 will see us working with the powerful unified image sampling engine, and then finally in Chapter 6 we can take a look at creating some important render effects, including depth of field, caustics and render time displacement. If you are ready to get up and running with Mental Ray in Maya, then let's go ahead and dive right in. Throughout this course I'm going to be making a concerted effort to keep you informed as to tool locations and keyboard shortcuts as I access and make use of them. I will, to some extent though, be working with the assumption that you have at least a basic working knowledge of Maya, meaning that you are familiar with the UI in general and that you know how to perform everyday tasks inside the application. If you are new to Maya, then I would recommend that you check out some of the great Maya titles already found here on raylinda.com, perhaps focusing initially on the essential training titles. You will also find that some basic knowledge of photography and perhaps Photoshop compositing can help make some of the tools and terminology used in this course a little more relatable. Now, while such skills can be helpful, they are by no means essential in order for you to work through and thoroughly benefit from this Up and Running with Mental Ray in Maya course. If you are a premium member of the raylinda.com online training library, you have access to the exercise files that will be used throughout the duration of this training title. These files can be found in the exercise files folder, which I have placed, as you can see here, on my desktop. You can of course store and access this folder from anywhere you like. There are files for most of the videos in the course and they reside inside a Maya project folder using scene subfolders that have been named according to the chapters they relate to. It isn't required that you use these particular files in order to follow along with and benefit from this course. You can use files containing your own work if you would prefer. Of course, if you are a monthly or annual subscriber to raylinda.com, you won't have access to the exercise files, but that same option of following along using scene files of your own is very much open to you. We have set up the scene files for this course using Maya's powerful project management tools, meaning we have made use of a very specific project folder in order to quickly and easily access each of the available scene files and their dependent assets from inside the Maya application. To ensure that you are set up and able to take advantage of this powerful file management workflow, we're going to quickly walk you through correctly setting up the Maya project folder for this course. To do that, we need, inside Maya of course, to open up the File menu and from down at the bottom of the options list, click to select the Set Project option. This opens up a dialog that will allow us to select any folder available on our storage devices and set it as our project root. In this instance I will want to locate the downloaded exercise files folder, which as noted has been placed on my desktop. Click to select it and then simply hit the Set button. Now our exercise files folder has been set up to serve as our project root. What we will find now is that whenever we use application functions such as open, export, import, or even go to save a rendered image to disk, we will find ourselves automatically taken to the appropriate folder inside our project structure. This means that whenever we need to open a new scene file for this course, all we have to do is use the open scene command, which will take us straight to the project scenes folder, and then from there simply select the appropriate chapter folder, and finally the appropriate scene file. In current rendering workflows, the use of high dynamic range images for both environment lighting and scene reflections has become almost ubiquitous, and our Up and Running with Mental Ray training course is no exception to that trend. In a number of scene files for the course then, we've made use of high dynamic range images. These have been downloaded from the excellent HDRI-Hub website, which has a number of free samples available. As these have been released under the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 Unported license, which allows for both commercial and non-commercial use of provided assets, we've been able to include a number of their images in the exercise files download. I would encourage you though to go and take a look at not only the other excellent HDRI collections found on the site, but also at some of the really nice video footage and texture file purchases that are available. Given that the handling of both incoming and outgoing gamma options has in recent years been greatly simplified in Maya by virtue of the colour management systems that have been introduced, and due to the fact that those colour management settings are saved within Maya's scene files, you shouldn't run into any gamma related discrepancies with the scene files for this course. Given the possibility, however, depending on how we have our copy of Maya set up, that we may run into a number of problems whilst creating scene files of our own, particularly so if we don't typically make use of Maya's colour management system, I would like to take a few minutes in this video to just point out the colour management settings that we have used in creating the scene files for this course, and then simply leave that information with you to use or disregard as you see fit. The first thing worth noting, although somewhat obvious from what I have so far said, is the fact that we are working with the colour management system in Maya enabled for this course. Unless we have some very specific pipeline reasons for not doing so, this is probably the safest and most predictable way in which to work. In my honest opinion, when working with photoreal renderers such as Mental Ray, V-Ray, Maxwell and the like, colour, or more critically gamma management tools such as those now found in Maya are essential if we are to get predictable and believable final rendered results. To enable colour management for our current Maya scene, we will need, using plain old Maya 2015 as we are here, to open up the render settings dialog, and in the colour management rollout found in the Common tab, put a check in the colour management option. If however we are using Maya 2015 with extension 1 installed, we will need to open up the application preferences editor, and after selecting the colour management option in the left hand column, put a check in the enable colour management box. Now to be honest, in terms of setting things up as we have them in the scene files for this course, we are pretty much finished, because for most typical rendering workflows, the Maya defaults, once colour management has been enabled, work pretty well. As is true in the real world, the rendering space, or where the light and colour calculations are made, works linearly, giving us a default output profile of linear sRGB, whereas the default input colour profile, so the assumed colour profile for incoming bitmaps, is set to sRGB, meaning that Maya is now set up to linearize or de-gamma all incoming bitmaps so that when colour calculations made in linear space are applied to them, everything will come out in the render just as it should. Of course, we do need to keep in mind the fact that any floating point or HDRI files that we add to our scenes may need to be set up locally to use the linear sRGB input type. The only other part of the equation we need to tweak a little here are the render view settings. If I just open up the render view window, open up the display menu, and click the colour management option, we need over in the attribute editor to set the image colour profile option to linear sRGB, essentially letting Maya know that all incoming pixel data to the render view will be in a linear format. Finally, we can leave the display colour profile set to sRGB, as this will give us a correct looking mid-tone adjusted image inside the render view window. Now of course, for studios and even freelancers with more specific and specialised colour management needs, the system here in Maya does offer lots of room for manoeuvring and setup. But Even with these straightforward and default settings in place, we will find ourselves in a much better situation from which to make full use of the power not just of Mental Ray, but that found in any of the photorealistic renderers that we may choose to work with. And remember, in order to work with the downloadable exercise files for this course, you don't have to worry about performing any of the setup that we have pointed out here, as everything should already be correctly saved and set up within the Maya scene files themselves. One thing that it can be useful to grasp when starting to work with the Mental Ray engine in any digital content creation application would be the important role that shaders play when it comes to providing features and functionality to the renderer. In fact, understanding shaders is in many ways the key to understanding Mental Ray itself. One thing we straight away need to be careful of then is the way in which we use or think of the word shader, as we may have a preconceived notion in our minds that doesn't fully fit the genuine definition of just what a shader is. Typically, in the world of computer graphics, artists will use the term shader in connection with material types or surface properties that are applied to geometric objects in a scene in order to give them a certain look or set of characteristics such as glass, metal, wood, and so on. Now, whilst there is nothing wrong with using the term shader in such a way, indeed it is perfectly applicable, the problem comes in that through common usage, many users new to 3D applications can be led to believe that a shader is only a material or surface shading algorithm, which of course is not the case. Indeed, Mental Ray's use of shaders goes much further than that. A definition given in layman's terms could say that a shader is a program that tells a computer how to draw something in a specific and unique way, which of course would include material types in a render engine, but that could also include drawing displacement, camera, lens, and exposure effects, to name just a few. The simple truth is that Mental Ray uses shaders and the term shaders to describe every aspect, every part of the rendering process carried out by the engine. These code blocks, as we can think of them, when combined together in certain configurations, are responsible for producing the renders and render effects that we know Mental Ray is capable of. Now, one very cool aspect of Mental Ray's usage of shaders is the fact that besides the wealth of functionality added to Mental Ray by means of the shaders written by the NVIDIA team themselves, third-party developers can also add needed features to the renderer, provided of course they have the programming skills required, in this instance the ability to use either the C or C++ languages. This kind of access can of course mean that even when Mental Ray doesn't currently support or have a particular feature available, one that may be useful or even necessary for our current project, we may well be able to go ahead and develop that tool for ourselves. To recap then, shaders are the code blocks that Mental Ray uses in order to produce all aspects of the rendering process, be that texturing, lighting, cameras, or even geometry-based effects. In short, shaders are the power behind Mental Ray. Whilst Mental Ray should always be available for use as a render engine inside our Maya scene files, it isn't in fact set up on application install to be the default production renderer. If I just open up the render settings window here, you can see that by default the Maya software engine occupies the render using slot. To permanently change this, all we need to do is open up the window menu, come to Settings, Preferences, and in the Preferences dialog that opens up, select the rendering option in the Settings section, choose Mental Ray from the Preferred Renderer drop-down, and then click Save. Each new Maya scene that we create now will have Mental Ray set up and ready to work with as the default production renderer. Again though, if you are using the downloadable exercise files for this course, things should be just fine, as the choice of render engine is also a piece of information that gets saved along with the Maya scene file itself. Once we have Mental Ray set up as our default render engine in Maya, as we now do, there are a number of choices that could or perhaps even should be made regarding the pipeline or workflow that we as the render artist are going to use. For instance, we could adopt what I often refer to as a Maya-centric approach to using a render engine, which is where we continue to use the same Maya lighting and material workflows that we may have gotten used to over a number of years whilst making use of the Maya software engine. This means we would continue to work with standard lights, such as the Omni, Spot and Direct options, along with Maya software-based materials such as Blinn, Fog and Lambert. The fact that these older lighting and material workflows can continue to be used when working with Mental Ray in Maya is in fact one of the impressive aspects of the Mental Ray implementation. The fact that all of these originally Maya software-specific tools just work seamlessly. Now, whilst this Maya-centric workflow may be an ideal way for us to quickly start using the engine in a production environment, giving us the opportunity to become familiar with its features, it does need to be said that there is arguably a better approach. Better simply because it gives us the ability to take full advantage of the power that is available in the Mental Ray renderer. In a render engine centric approach then, we would take advantage of, in this instance, Mental Ray specific versions of essential daily use tools such as lights, materials and exposure controls, to name just a few. Probably one of the biggest advantages to this workflow is the fact that it can help optimize our render pipeline efficiency and so ultimately affect the quality of our final output. We get an efficiency in workflow because the tools we will use on a day-to-day basis will be ones that have been designed to work together. They integrate well, which of course creates natural internal efficiency from the render engine, everything having been written as a Mental Ray tool and having been optimized to work as efficiently as possible with the renderer's own internal algorithms. This in turn can bring us an increase in final render quality, as we can use the time now saved to fine-tune and tweak all aspects of our scene so as to get the very best final render possible, in the time frame allowed by our project, that is. Now ultimately, of course, the choice of how we work with our Maya and Mental Ray combination will be entirely up to us. Indeed, oftentimes Maya artists will mix and match various aspects of the two approaches outlined here with a number of their own preferences and essentially invent a hybrid workflow that works well for them. Ultimately, as long as we are producing both the required quality and quantity of work from our pipeline, then all is good. These suggestions simply serve as a reminder that we do need to think carefully about what it is that we want or need from our lighting and rendering workflow. One really nice render feature we have access to in Maya is the Interactive Photorealistic Renderer, or IPR for short. This essentially turns Maya's render view into an interactive render window that can update, that is re-render, each and every time we make a change to our scene. Current IPR renderers installed by default in Maya include the Maya software and Mental Ray engines. Enabling IPR when rendering with Mental Ray in Maya is a very straightforward process in that all we need to do is click the IPR icon found at the top of the main UI. This will clear out the render view frame buffer for us and at the same time prompts us to select a region to begin tuning. Obviously, the fewer pixels we render, the less memory required and the faster our IPR updates can take place. In this instance, as I do want to include the full frame here for demonstration purposes, I'm going to click and drag across the whole window and instantly inside that selection we see an interactive render begin. The brilliant thing here is that should I now go ahead and make a change to the scene by either shifting my camera view or moving objects around as I have done here, or by making a tweak to something like the lighting or materials in the scene, Mental Ray will detect those changes and then restart the IPR process in order to show the updates that have been made. Of course, if we have a number of quick tweaks that we want to make to a scene, having the render restart with each and every parameter change would probably be a fairly inefficient way in which to work. What we can do instead then is actually pause the IPR process, make any number of changes we feel necessary, and then unpause in order to have all of those changes register and then update in one smooth action. If we want to stop the IPR process altogether, all we need to do is hit the stop button that has been made available in the render view UI. Now, if we for some reason would prefer to use the standard Mental Ray production renderer as opposed to progressive mode for IPR, we can certainly go ahead and set that up by either from the render view IPR menu, coming down to the IPR quality option and unchecking progressive mode from the flyout there, or we could, in the render settings window, come into the quality tab and in the sampling rollout set the progressive engine to off. Now when we create an IPR render, Mental Ray will use the perhaps more familiar standard rendering mode. In fact, we can from here set up Mental Ray to work in progressive mode all of the time if we so desire. We do this by setting the progressive option to on. Now, even when we hit the standard as opposed to IPR render button, what we will see is Mental Ray operating in progressive render mode. Let's just go ahead and stop that by hitting the escape key and setting the progressive option back to its default IPR only setting. One big item we will need to keep in mind here is the fact that, as already noted, our current image and material sampling settings will very much impact the speed at which the IPR process works. As with standard mode, higher sampling rates will give us a cleaner, higher quality IPR image, but they will also cause it to take longer to resolve, potentially reducing IPR's usefulness as an interactive system. Beyond a shadow of a doubt though, having the Mental Ray progressive and standard operating modes available as IPR options offers up a wealth of potential when it comes to improving our workflow in quite a few areas of the production pipeline, but especially so in those connected to scene staging, lighting and material creation. The Mental Ray Sun and Sky system in Maya can be used to create a complete and realistic looking daylight simulation with parameters that give us control over almost every aspect of lighting and environment setup. To add a Mental Ray physical sun and sky system to our scenes, all we need to do is open up the render settings dialog and in the indirect lighting tab, click the create button for the physical sun and sky option. In the attribute editor, the options for the MIA physical sky node become active, and in the scene, we're ready to render with a full daylight simulation system in place. It really is as easy as that. The system we have created consists of a standard directional light with a physical sun shader override applied that sits in the scene and controls the directional light of the sun itself, whilst the MIA physical sky environment, which has been attached to our camera as an environment shader, takes care of sky lighting. The actual position of our directional light in the scene doesn't, for all intents and purposes, really matter, as positional information doesn't play any part in controlling light direction. This is all handled by the light's rotation settings, meaning we could happily leave our light object right where it is at this moment in time and start to tweak our lighting setup by means of rotational values alone. Personally though, I always prefer to place any lights that I have in the scene in a manner that gives me instant visual feedback regarding both the direction and angle from which the light, the sun in this instance, will be coming. To do that here, let's, over in the outliner, select the sun direction node from down at the bottom of the list, make certain that we are in the sun shape tab in the attribute editor, and then in the object display rollout, set our direct lights locator scale to something like 3000. This just makes it much easier to both see and select in the scene. We can now turn on the lights manipulator by using either the icon found on the general shelf or, as I will here, by simply hitting the T key. Now, the first thing I want to do is grab the target manipulator in the viewport, this is the small empty cyan square, and move it down in the view, just enough to reveal the light manipulator itself sitting just behind, which I can then grab and move up toward the top of our building here. We will be tweaking our sun position some more in this view in a little while, but this will do as a starting position. If preferred, we can now place the target manipulator back at ground level, although given that this won't make any noticeable difference to our final lighting result, I'm just going to leave things as they are for now. Next, we want to come to the viewport's panel menu, and from the orthographic camera's flyout, choose the custom cam top option that we have already set up in the scene. This is a straight copy of the default top view orthographic camera, but one that has in this instance been raised much higher in the scene so as to avoid clipping plane problems with our at scale geometry. From this view, we can now place our directional light in the small gap between the two buildings sitting in the back here. When we're done, we can switch back to our main camera view. Now this move has in fact placed our sun in more or less the final position that we want, but let's tweak it a little so that it sits just at the top or tip of the sixth ring, counting from the floor upward, just in between the two main towers. Now if we want to see what kind of shadow this is going to produce in the scene, we can of course turn on lights and shadows for the viewport and then fine tune our light's position for maximum effect. With all of that done, we can go ahead and take a render in order to see what we have created so far. Probably the first thing we will notice is that our render is looking quite washed out. This is being caused by the fact that when we created the physical sun and sky, Maya behind the scenes applied an MIA exposure simple node to the viewing camera as a lens shader, which, if I just select in order to jump into its options, we can see is in fact applying a 2.2 gamma correction to our render, in addition to the sRGB colour correction already being applied in the render view by Maya's colour management systems. To have things render correctly then, we will need to set the gamma value here to 1.0, and then we can render again. What we get from Mental Ray now does indeed look like a fairly decent daylight simulation given the angle and position of the sun in the sky. Now of course, we are only using Mental Ray's default final gather and image sampling settings here, so things have plenty of room for improvement quality-wise. Even so, focusing on just the lighting created, we can see that we have definitely added a very natural looking daylight solution to the scene without really having done too much work at all. Of course, Mental Ray being the renderer that it is, adding the sun and sky system to the scene is only the tip of the iceberg with regard to the control over scene lighting and so ultimately scene mood that we have available. In our next video then, we're going to take a look at the controls available for the physical sun aspect of this daylight system. Having already set up our physical sun and sky in the scene, what we want to do in this video is take a look at the controls available on the physical sun node that can be used by an artist to affect a variety of lighting elements in the scene. Now it does need to be noted straight away that quite a number of controls found on the physical sun node are also present on the physical sky and are in fact by default controlled by it. This is because the two lighting elements can be added separately to a scene should we want or need to. Whenever they are used together, however, these common controls have to be taken care of by one or the other of them. As in this chapter, we are simply using the sun and sky defaults, we will skip over the currently unavailable sun controls in this video. The first option we see on the physical sun then is the ability to control both shadow softness and shadow smoothness. And by softness, we're referring to the look of our shadow edges or penumbra, so how much of a gradient or fall off do our shadows have. The default value of 1 is designed to produce a physically accurate shadow penumbra given the angle and intensity of sun in the scene, although we can of course alter this and so set a value of 0 for completely sharp edged shadows, or push things above 1 in order to create exaggerated softness in our shadow edges. The problem with creating softer shadow edges of course is the fact that more samples are going to be required in order to stop them looking overly noisy and so unappealing, which is where the smoothness aspect we mentioned comes in. This is controlled by the samples option, with higher values adding more samples in order to produce a cleaner, smoother result that will in turn of course add a little more to our overall render times. If it is that we are going to be using global illumination photons in our scene, then one feature that we will probably want to make use of is the photon bounding box. This option gives us the ability to create an emission zone inside which photons from the physical sun will be created. This in turn means that the physical sun can now become an extremely efficient photon casting light source, with the target zone being set to encompass some very specific areas of the scene, those inside which photons are actually needed. We could think, for instance, of an open window through which sunlight would be streaming, which is in fact a scenario that we will work with a little later in this course. We also have an automatic photon energy option, which once enabled negates the need for our light source, in this case our directional light, to have its photon energy value set manually. And we do though need to have a non-zero energy value, otherwise photon emission will be disabled by Mental Ray. With this option on, the energy and colour of the sun's photons will be automatically and correctly calculated. If the parameter is left off, however, photon energy will be defined by the directional light's photon energy value. In the extra attributes rollout, we're given the ability to switch the way in which the sun's intensity values are calculated. If the luminous mode is set to 0, then the default and internal intensity calculation method is used, whereby solar intensity is based on a number of parameters such as haze, solar angle, optical air mass, and so on. If the luminous mode is set to 1, however, then the sun will need to be fed an intensity value in lux by means of the direct normal illuminance parameter. The colour of the sunlight, however, will still be driven by the haze setting as before. Typical average ranges for sunlight are 80 to 100,000 lux on a clear sunny day and 35 to 50,000 lux on an overcast day. Now of course we do need to keep in mind the fact that the physical sun is only one half of the daylight system that we have created here, with the MIA physical sky being the other. In our next video then, let's take a look at the controls available there and see how they can be used to affect the look of our daylight simulation renders. Although we would naturally tend to think of the sun in a daylight setup as the key or dominant light element, it is in fact the sky part of the equation in the mental ray physical sun and sky system that has the greater portion of controls available to it. The first three options found on the physical sky, that is the on-off checkbox, the multiplier and the RGB conversion controls, all deal with the input of light energy to the scene and can be worked with in order to either increase or decrease light values as and when required. The first of the more artistically oriented controls that we come to, however, is the haze parameter. This is designed to mimic the amount of water vapour and other particulate matter found in the atmosphere. The usable range, although we can push this as far as we like, tends to go from 0, which produces the look of a completely clear day, to around about 15, which gives us an extremely overcast sky with lots of scattered light in the scene. The haze parameter influences not only the intensity and colour of the sky and horizon, but also the intensity and colour of the sunlight in the scene, the softness of the physical sun shadows, the softness of the glow around the sun, and the strength of any aerial perspective that we may be using. All in all, a pretty impactful parameter. Next we come to the non-physical red-blue shift control. This gives us the ability to quite dramatically alter colour in our environment. A minimum value of -1 will produce extreme blue coloration, whilst a max value of +1 will push the environment towards extreme reds, although visually speaking what we actually get looks much more like orange than red to my eyes. Saturation is an interesting control that gives us, as the name suggests, the ability to both increase and decrease the colour contribution from our daylighting system. At a value of 1 we get a physically correct saturation level in the scene, based of course on the orientation of the sun. At a value of 0 we get no colour coming from the environment, and so we are essentially working with a high dynamic range grayscale, and with values pushed above the default of 1 we naturally boost the level of colour saturation. Now do keep in mind here that we are talking about colour contribution coming from the sun and sky system, not colour values in the pixels of our final render. If I, for instance, input the saturation value of 0 here, so creating a grayscale environment, you can see in the resulting render that we still have plenty of coloured objects or coloured pixels in the image. The sun and sky themselves, however, are no longer adding any extra colour contribution. We also have horizon height and horizon blur controls that are somewhat connected to the ground colour option that we will take a look at in just a moment. With all of the geometry in the scene hidden, we can see that the height control gives us the ability to determine where the dividing line between the ground and sky elements will sit in our renders. Positive values, so let's say +2 here, will raise the horizon up, whilst negative values, so -2, will take it down. The blur option, set here at a value of 1, creates a very obvious gradient between the two distinct areas of the physical sky map. The ground colour control is a sometimes overlooked aspect of the sun and sky system, even though it can play a part in the coloration of light in our scene. To show how it works, let's set the ground colour on the physical sky to something like a strong green, and then turn off the sun part of our system by selecting the sun shape tab and unchecking the direct lights illuminate by default option. You can see in the render taken from this setup, with only our ground geometry now hidden, that we get a very strong green colour cast coming from the ground's direction. Now typically of course the ground colour will be blocked by geometry in the scene and so have little or no effect on a final render. It is good to be aware, however, of just how this part of the sun and sky system can work so that we can use it to our advantage should the occasion call for it. Back in the physical sky tab, the sun direction and sun controls are by default tied to the directional light that is created as a part of the sun and sky system, which means the position of the sun in the sky can easily be controlled by simply rotating our directional light. If for some reason though we want to control placement of the sun manually, as it were, we can do that by breaking the connection here and entering coordinate values of our own. The disk intensity option controls the visual brightness of the central sun disk in a render, whilst the glow intensity option handles the gradiented glow that we see surrounding that sun. And if I just set the glow intensity to 0 here, we can see, again in the resulting render, just how much of the visual appearance of the sun is being created by this parameter. Now, if we or our art director decide that the sun disk we are seeing really needs to be either smaller or larger in the shot, we can easily use the scale value here to set things accordingly. The value of 1 should be considered as at real world scale, based again on the orientation of the sun in the scene, with the default of 4 giving us a little bit of artistic exaggeration. Having looked already then at quite a number of controls found on the physical sky node, let's move on to our next exercise where we can take a look at those that are still yet remaining. Having already looked at quite a number of the controls found on the MIA Physical Sky Environment shader, we're going to continue moving forward in this exercise and take a look at the remainder of them, starting first of all with the Use Background control. This is a very nice piece of functionality that gives us the ability to use something other than the MIA Physical Sky as the background or backdrop image for our render. To show how this works, let's enable the option and then click to open up the Create Render Node browser. As we are wanting to add a spherical environment map here, we are first of all going to need to add an MIB lookup spherical node, which we can filter for, and then in the texture slot that the lookup node makes available, navigate to the HDRI hub folder, found of course inside our project structure, and from there select the harbour_3_free_modified.hdr file. Once done, a render reveals that we are indeed now using this HDR map as the background or backdrop for our render. Obviously, nothing has changed with regard to lighting in the scene. All of that is still being handled as per the sun and sky controls looked at in previous exercises. This of course can be a very handy feature for helping set up match lighting with background plates in a very intuitive manner. And speaking of compositing, one nice thing about this Use Background feature, if I just go back to our physical sky controls and break the connection to the background map, is that with the option still enabled, but with no map specified, I can take a render and get full physical sun and sky lighting, but this time placed against a pure black background, which for many compositing artists is how they would prefer to receive such images. The Y is up checkbox that we see here is one that we can happily ignore if rendering with an automatically generated sun and sky system in the scene, given that it is by default enabled for us. If we should however find ourselves manually adding the physical sky as an environment shader to our rendering camera, then we will need to make certain that we also manually enable this option, otherwise our scene lighting will come out looking somewhat wrong. Aerial perspective is a term coined by painters to describe the way in which objects in the distance are perceived as hazier and tinted a little towards the blue portion of the light spectrum. Mental Ray uses the visibility distance parameter to recreate this phenomenon. With the value here set to a specific distance measurement, we in effect define the distance at which approximately 10% of haze will be visible in a render, even though, confusingly, we may have the haze level still set at a value of 0. Now, in order for this to work, we will need to have our physical sky assigned not just as an environment shader, but also as either a camera lens or volume shader. As we already have it assigned to the volume slot in this scene, with a distance value of 2000 centimeters set, we can see in the resulting render that we now have very obvious haze present in the environment, obscuring background objects and, as we said, tinting them a little towards the blue end of the spectrum. This is aerial perspective in action, which, of course, when used well, can add an awful lot of realism to external daylight renders, especially those meant to be looking across large distances. The Sky Luminance Mode option can change the algorithms being employed by Mental Ray in order to create skylighting in a scene. The The default value of 0 uses the haze-driven option, which, as we've already noted, is designed to mimic the amount of water vapour and other particulate matter in the atmosphere using a haze value. If the sky luminance mode is set to 1, however, then the Perez model is used, and luminance of the sky can be defined by setting either the zenith luminance parameter, which is a candela per square metre measurement, or by setting a known diffuse horizontal illuminance value, which in this instance is set in lux. Now this is an either-or situation. We cannot use both of these controls. If though the sky luminance mode is set at 2, then the zenith luminance parameter will be calculated using not the Perez but rather the CIE clear sky model. Now although not to be followed as a strict rule in any way, we may want to think of the haze-driven option as something to be used when artistic control is of more importance to us on a project, as compared to the Perez and CIE models, which can be employed when the output of photometrically accurate data in our renders is of greater concern.
In photography, exposure is the amount of light that is allowed to fall onto whatever photographic medium is in use, be that film or a digital image sensor. The more light allowed, the brighter or more exposed an image becomes, whilst going in the opposite direction, allowing less light that is, naturally produces darker or less exposed images. In Maya, this same basic principle can be used when lighting and rendering with Mental Ray, as we have access to exposure shaders that can help us control how bright or dark our final renders will be. Certainly, if we are wanting to follow a physical and so photographically correct rendering workflow, then applying and working with these exposure shaders will be one way in which we can go about things. Now whilst if I just turn the Use All Lights option on whilst using Viewport 2.0 here, the current representation of our scene in the viewport suggests that our lighting levels might not look too bad come render time. If I just come up to the main toolbar and actually take a render, you can quickly see that we do indeed have a little bit of a problem, as most, if not all, of the brighter surface materials in the scene are getting fairly blown out. This is happening despite the fact that, by default, the physical sun and sky in Maya are dialed down in terms of their light energy output in order to allow them to more closely match standard Maya lights at an intensity value of 1. Without some kind of control applied to the final render, then any bright materials in our scene will blow or burn out much more than is desirable. One quick and easy way to solve this problem is to render with one of Mental Ray's tone mapping or exposure controls applied as a lens shader to the rendering camera. The choice is available if I just select my camera, come into the attribute editor, click to create a lens shader node, and then click to look in the Lenses section of the Create Render Node dialog are the MIA Exposure Simple and MIA Exposure Photographic options. Now, although it is Exposure Simple that gets applied by default in Maya whenever a sun and sky system is created, it is, in my opinion, the photographic exposure control that is by far the easier and more powerful with which to work, mimicking as it does the typical exposure controls found on both digital and film cameras, these of course being the f-stop, shutter speed and ISO values. Now it is worth noting here that these Mental Ray settings, unlike those found on a real camera, have no control over depth of field or motion blur effects in a render. Mental Ray has dedicated controls for handling each of those, and these are kept separate from the exposure control process. Once then a suitable exposure setting has been dialed in, the MIA photographic option has a number of image control or post-processing options with which we can work, such as white point, vignetting, highlights and shadow controls, as well as saturation and gamma options that can all make quite a difference to the tone mapping or final look of our render. Of course, if we are handling all of our gamma requirements through Maya's colour management system, as we indeed are, then we will probably always want to set the gamma value here to 1.0, or at least something fairly close to that, so as to prevent the washed out look that we encountered earlier in this chapter. Now if I go ahead and take another render at this moment in time, you would perhaps be forgiven for thinking that we have really taken a step backwards by adding our lens shader, given that our render is now coming out looking pretty much completely black, which would seem to clearly suggest that something in our scene isn't working or perhaps isn't set up quite correctly. which is exactly what we will move on to investigating in our very next exercise. Having applied MIA exposure photographic as a lens shader to the rendering camera in our scene, we found at the conclusion of our previous exercise that we had left ourselves with a bit of a problem in that the default settings for the tone mapping shader were now giving us a completely black render. The reason for this happening is that MIA exposure photographic has in fact been set up with defaults that make use of what photographers refer to as the sunny 16 rule, which basically says that on a clear and sunny day with an aperture setting of f16, which we have by default, we will get a correct, or at least a pleasing exposure by using a shutter speed that is set as the inverse of the ISO value in use, 1/100th of a second of course being the inverse value of ISO 100 that we are using here. The problem lies in that these photographic exposure settings are naturally assuming that light energy levels in the scene will equate to those found in the real world on a clear and sunny day, which is not in fact what we are currently getting from our physical sun and sky. You see, by default the energy or RGB unit conversion for these in Maya has, as already noted in the previous exercise, been dialed down so as to more closely match the lighting levels that come from Maya's standard lights when set at an intensity value of 1. The help file for Mental Ray notes though that an interesting alternative to the existing setup would be to use an RGB unit conversion value of 0.318 on all channels, as this would cause the final rendered pixels in our images, when rendered with energy conserving materials, to use true photometric luminance values as measured in candelas per square meter. These true luminance values would then react perfectly when input to the photographic tone mapper with its CM2 factor set at a value of 1.0. Well, let's give that a try and see what happens. Firstly though, as the sunny 16 rule when rendered in any version of Mental Ray always looks a little on the dark side to me, and given that the sun orientation we are using in this scene equates to about a mid-November afternoon, I'm going to reduce our aperture here by 1 whole stop and set it to a value of f8. In fact, whilst we're here, let's set up some other tone mapping tweaks by setting our burn highlights at a value of 0.15 and our crush blacks to 0.2. Now we're ready to go and set up a more photometrically accurate unit conversion for our physical sun and sky nodes. To do that with the lighting setup we are using in this scene, we will in fact need to apply the new energy conversion rate to both the physical sun and sky nodes separately. This is because both of these were in fact added to the scene manually as opposed to using the Create Sun and Sky button. First of all then, let's come to the outliner, select the sun direction node, and then over in the attribute editor switch to the physical sun tab where we can click on the RGB unit conversion color swatch and in the value field input the required 0.318 value as outlined in the Mental Ray help. If we were to take a render now, we would see that we have indeed boosted the direct sunlight in the scene, but of course balanced daylighting consists of illumination that comes from both sun and sky light elements. To input the energy conversion for the physical sky as well then, let's select the IBL node in the outliner, access the controlling texture, and in the physical sky that we have applied there, also enter a value of 0.318 for all three R, G and B channels. When we take a render now, what we get in terms of illumination levels looks very much appropriate for our current scene setup, and we can of course now alter our lighting levels using familiar photographic exposure controls. When using real-world light values then, or when just wanting to add a more photographic approach to our rendering workflow, it certainly makes sense to follow the same basic approach to image creation as used for an actual photograph. Exposure control of course being fundamental to that look. To the casual observer, it may be easy to miss the fact that as of Maya 2015, support for Mental Ray's native IBL rendering mode has been added to the main user interface controls. This could previously, of course, only be accessed by means of the Mental Ray string options. I say easy to miss because the initial setup in order to make use of Mental Ray native IBL is identical to that of what is now being referred to as legacy IBL in Maya. Yes, the old method for creating image-based lighting in Mental Ray is still available,
but given the inherent power of Mental Ray's native IBL rendering, it has now been demoted to legacy status. To get an idea of what native IBL brings to the table, it would probably be a good idea for us to first of all set up a render in the old-fashioned way and then compare the resulting image to that of a Mental Ray native version. The scene we're going to use in order to do so does of course present quite a challenge to any kind of environment lighting setup, given that it consists of some very tight and enclosed spaces. To get started then, let's open up the render settings window and in the indirect lighting tab, click to create an image-based lighting node in the scene. Over in the attribute editor, we will need to put a check in the emit light option found in the light emission rollout, which now looks quite a bit different than in versions of Maya prior to 2015. Gone are the wealth of options that used to be available for fine-tuning the IBL render, and instead all we have now is a quality slider along with some resolution and sampling options that can be found in the advanced rollout. In the legacy rollout, however, if we just open that up, we see that we do still have all of the old IBL controls available to us, although they are currently greyed out and unavailable for use. To bring them to life, we need to come back into the light emission rollout and put a check in the legacy option. Given that this particular method for creating and working with IBL in Maya has been well covered in a number of courses already found here on lynda.com, I'm not going to dwell on what all of these controls do, but will instead jump straight to adding a HDRI file to the mix so that we can go ahead and take a test render using just the current defaults. To do that, let's click on the file load icon in the IBL attributes rollout, and from the source images and HDRI hub folders in our exercise files project structure, load up the harbour_3_free_modified.hdr file. As the default mapping options here will work just fine, given that the image we are using is a spherical HDRI, we can simply go ahead and hit the render button in order to make use of Mental Ray's default settings for both IBL and Final Gather. Do be aware though, this render could take some time to complete. Well, after rendering for more than 8 minutes to create this 960 by 540 render, what we have is, well, quite a way short of ideal, to be honest. Although some areas of the render seem to be fairly well illuminated, especially so given that we are using no extra diffuse bounces of light in our Final Gather settings, other parts of the image are definitely way too overexposed, having blown out to complete white. We can also see that the HDR image in the background of our render is showing up pretty dark really in comparison to the illumination levels that we are seeing. Clearly, we would need to do quite a bit of work here in order to generate a decent looking lighting solution from this setup. Rather than doing that though, let's make the switch and see what we get from the default settings using Mental Ray's native IBL option. To make this a true test, we are of course going to make no changes at all to our current settings, and so after unchecking the legacy option in our light emission rollout and saving our current image for comparison, let's go ahead and hit the render button once again. Now whilst what we get in the finished render is clearly way too dark, given the daylight setting found in the HDR image providing the lighting, it has nevertheless rendered in just a fraction of the time, coming in at around about the 1 minute mark. It also has an illumination level that is much more in line with the brightness of the HDRI as we see it in the background, meaning we are straight away, with no settings altered, getting a much more balanced and believable lighting solution from our IBL setup. To bring our illumination levels up, we could of course add a Mental Ray exposure shader to our camera lens and make the necessary adjustments right here in Maya. Or if it is that we're going to be taking our renders into post-production applications, we could instead use RenderView's handy exposure control in order to see how things will look when boosted in a post application such as Composite, After Effects or even Photoshop. A value of 1.0 should do nicely. Now of course things are looking a little noisy in the render here due to the shadow quality settings currently at work on the IBL node. To clean things up, all we would need to do is set our IBL quality slider to a value of 1, and so long as we are using decent quality settings in our unified sampling controls, we should get a fairly smooth looking result from most render scenarios. Before closing, one cool aspect of Mental Ray's native IBL rendering that is worth keeping in mind is the fact that without the use of any GI tools at all, we can still get a very nice skylight effect from the system, given that native IBL rendering in Mental Ray is in fact a direct light source, in much the same vein as the dome light found in the V-Ray render engine. When using the light source in this manner, there will of course be no flickering GI or any such problems to worry about should we have any kind of animation in our scene. So long as IBL is used in conjunction with high quality HDR images and decent image sampling settings, the quality of the final renders from Mental Ray's native IBL mode will pretty much always speak for themselves. The Mental Ray renderer has a number of powerful global illumination or GI systems available that can all be used to create or even recreate pretty much any lighting scenario required. There is photon mapping, referred to in the Maya UI as global illumination, final gather, irradiance particles, and importance. We gain access to these systems through the indirect lighting tab found in Maya's render settings dialog. Here we have a host of direct and indirect lighting tools, including the IBL, physical sun and sky, as well as caustic photon options. Now it does have to be said that despite being Mental Ray's oldest GI tools, meaning they have been around for quite some time, the photon mapping and final gather feature sets that we will look at in this chapter are extremely powerful, production proven tools that give us the ability to easily switch between physically correct and artistically correct approaches to our lighting setups. These systems can, as with the newer irradiance particle and importance options, be tuned for speed should we find ourselves working with demanding production schedules, or they can be set up to focus on outputting extremely high quality final renders, although these will of course take somewhat longer to complete. Ultimately, what all of these GI tools can do is remove a lot of the guesswork and oftentimes artistic fudging that can be required should we find ourselves trying to manually recreate realistic or even photographic lighting solutions. Now, for the benefit of viewers who may be somewhat new to 3D rendering in general, we're going to take a minute or two here so as to explain and hopefully illustrate just what it is that indirect lighting, or global illumination as a whole, actually does. In fact, a clear understanding of indirect illumination can probably best be gained by contrasting it against its computer graphics lighting opposite, which would be local or direct illumination. In our scene here, we have a single Mental Ray area spotlight sitting up above the torus knot, providing the sole source of illumination for this environment. Now by default, adding lights such as this into a 3D scene and then rendering without any kind of GI systems enabled will always produce the local or direct illumination effect that we see here. This is where only surfaces that are directly visible to a light, that is, only surfaces that are in the light source's direct line of sight, receive illumination. This computer graphics version of lighting is not, of course, how light behaves in the real world, which is why we need GI systems in our render engines, giving us, as they do, the ability to simulate the physical reality of light, which of course spends a lot of time and it spends a lot of energy bouncing around the physical environments that we inhabit. The basic process of just how light works in the real world goes something like this. Once direct light is emitted from a source, it travels through an environment until it strikes the surface of an object. At this point, a lighting phenomenon known as intersurface reflection takes place, with a percentage of the travelling light energy now being reflected or bounced around the localized environment. It is this bouncing or light reflection that creates what we refer to in general as ambient lighting, and it is this effect that in CG is referred to as global or indirect illumination. Now, the number of times that a particular packet or photon of light energy can bounce will depend to a large extent upon the amount or level of energy being output from the light source itself. Whether we are talking about a nuclear sun or a 60-watt light bulb though, one thing is constant: light will almost always bounce, and bounce a number of times. With each interaction it will of course lose a bit of energy, and with each bounce it will pick up a little bit of coloration inherited from the diffuse properties of the surfaces with which it has up to this point interacted. The end result of this bouncing is of course the fact that our surroundings become lit, and even the dark nooks and crannies of a space can end up receiving at least some level of illumination, even though they may be quite far away from any actual direct light sources. The fact that Mental Ray's indirect or GI lighting systems can mimic the extremely complex process that we call lighting is really the key to our being able to create lighting scenarios in our renders that have a very high degree of accuracy and, perhaps more importantly, realism about them. With a basic understanding of global illumination under our belts then, let's move on and examine a very specific aspect of Mental Ray's GI toolset, this being the irradiance mapping or final gather engine. Irradiance mapping is a term that is probably most widely associated with the V-Ray renderer, given that it is the name of one of its primary global illumination engines. It is also, though, a technology that has been used in Mental Ray for the longest time, although it is known here by the name Final Gather. In fact, over recent years, Final Gather has probably become, with the introduction of extra diffuse bounce calculations, Mental Ray's most used GI engine. In this video, we want to spend a bit of time running over the basics of just how irradiance mapping works, simply because understanding the basic principles of the technology can oftentimes go a long way towards helping us make good use of the features and controls it offers. One thing we do need to note right from the start then is that irradiance mapping, along with photons and irradiance particles, are view-dependent global illumination technologies. This means that the indirect lighting solution is calculated or created only from the rendering camera's point of view. If the rendering camera is moved after the irradiance mapping solution has been calculated, well, unfortunately, the lighting solution then becomes somewhat unusable at that point, as there will now be areas of the environment visible to that rendering camera, but that haven't had GI calculated for them. This is why, by default, Final Gather in Mental Ray is set to recalculate the irradiance map solution each and every time a render is started. Now, there are of course options or strategies available that can be used should we have moving cameras or even moving objects in our scenes. For instance, in the Final Gathering tracing rollout, we have access to mode options that let us optimize Final Gather for use in animation situations. We also, in the Final Gathering map rollout, have the ability to both save and reuse Final Gather map files. These can be written to disk and then locked so that only they are used to reproduce the lighting solution for a render. Another important fact we need to be aware of with regard to Final Gather, or irradiance mapping in general, is that it, by default, only traces a single bounce of light in an environment. Now, don't be fooled by the fact that the diffuse bounces control in Maya reads 0 by default, as this value in reality refers only to the number of extra bounces that Final Gather can add. In fact, to prove that simply enabling Final Gather does indeed add light bounce to a scene, let's take a render in our test environment, first of all with Final Gather turned off. What we get, as we would perhaps expect with only a single direct light source in the scene, are quite a few completely black areas showing up in our render. Well, let's save this image for comparison and then see what happens when we simply enable Final Gather and leave the diffuse bounces option set at the default of 0. Well, scrubbing to compare the two images now shows that there is most definitely bounce light present in our scene, 1 bounce to be precise. Of course, we still haven't looked here at the actual working process for irradiance mapping, so let's quickly step through the basics of just how it works. As this is a view-dependent technique, the initial set of rays used in the calculation of a GI solution are traced from the rendering camera itself, being sent out into the scene so that Mental Ray can make an evaluation. It is actually looking for areas of high contrast to help it decide where on our geometric surfaces it needs to place the highest proportion of the user-specified irradiance sample count. The number of initial samples used in this phase will be controlled by the point density option. Remember, these samples can only be placed in areas of the scene that are directly visible to the rendering camera, or that can be seen through reflections and/or refractions. Once these initial Final Gather points have been placed, and here we will focus in on just a single sample, a hemispherical dome of rays is then traced from each and every Final Gather point in the scene. These are sent out to more accurately calculate the level of illumination that ought to be displayed in the final render. The number of secondary rays used here is set by means of the accuracy control. These rays can bounce a number of times, the exact number being specified in the diffuse bounces control. Now, one of the great things about irradiance mapping is that it can, if needed, be created over the course of several adaptive passes, with each pass adding more samples to the solution as and when they are needed, meaning a full and complete solution can be efficiently created. Once these operations are complete, Mental Ray will take a specific number of the already computed illumination points and then interpolate or blend between them in order to create a smoother looking GI solution.
The number of samples used for this blending operation will be controlled by the point interpolation parameter. After all of this has taken place, Mental Ray is now ready to begin the rendering process and produce a final image for us. With irradiance mapping basics dealt with then, let's move on to actually using Final Gather in a more challenging test scene and see just how good a lighting solution it can produce for us. As already noted, probably the most